All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pocket Size Bio with Dr. Casco. In today's video, we're going to talk about cell respiration of the WACE ATAR biology program. And this is part of the WACE Nelson textbook that we've been using, right? So we're in chapter 10, section 7, which is cellular respiration. And within cell respiration, we're going to talk about aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. Okay, so let's get started. In the previous video, you were looking at another process, right? An anabolic chemical reaction, right? A series of chemical reactions, which is photosynthesis, right? In that video, you saw how plants, or autotrophs, they collect, carbon dioxide, sunlight, and water through a series of reactions, light-dependent and light-independent reactions to essentially produce glucose and oxygen, right? In different areas of the cell, with different structures and so forth. And in this case, we use the products of photosynthesis, right? Which is oxygen and glucose, and undergo a series of ultimately catabolic reactions to produce ATP, right? In a nutshell, this is what cell respiration is about, okay? So where is this happening? Where is this occurring? And of course, it occurs in animals, right? In animal cells, right? Like us. Plants can also undergo this process since they have mitochondria. The organelle in which this process actually occurs in, right, is the mitochondria, right? Not solely. There is some parts, some biochemical processes that occur throughout the cytosol of the cell, right? And then some other stages of cell respiration that occurs in the mitochondria, as we're going to take a look at. All right. Ultimately, the whole process of cellular respiration, right? You want to produce ATP, right? From glucose, from the breakdown of glucose, right? So you want to metabolize glucose to create chemical energy. Okay. Cell respiration can be broken down into two parts, right? Depending if oxygen is present or not. Okay. Whenever you do have oxygen present, it's referred to as aerobic respiration, and aerobic basically means presence of oxygen, right? And this aerobic respiration occurs in the mitochondria, right? And any organism that uses this pathway to produce ATP are referred to as aerobes, right? And then there's a type of respiration that doesn't use oxygen, right? Where oxygen is absent. It is referred to as anaerobic, right? Respiration, and it occurs in the cytoplasm. And oxygen is basically isn't used, right? And any organisms that are belonging to this pathway, right, are referred to as anaerobes, okay? And it undergoes anaerobic respiration, okay? So both autotrophs, like I mentioned before, plants, right, and consumers and humans and animals, right, perform this respiration, this process of respiration, right? So if we focus on aerobic respiration, I'm going to go just a little bit lower here, right? Scroll upwards here, downwards. Oops. Aerobic respiration is further broken down into three parts, right? You have glycolysis, right? You have this first kind of stage or part. Then you have the citric acid cycle. It's also referred to as the Krebs cycle. And you have the electron transport chain, right? Stage there. Okay. All these three work together ultimately to produce energy. Okay. So if you take a look at this table here, the overall chemical equation of aerobic respiration, which you do need to know in detail in a word form and in a chemical equation balance form, right? You have glucose, C6H12O6, plus oxygen, right? 6 molecules of oxygen to be precise. They react, they undergo some chemical pathways to be consumed, which would yield ultimately, right, 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of water, plus energy in the form of ATP, right? So make sure you memorize these chemical equations, right? And these components of the chemical equation. Okay. And we're going to go step by step, right, through each of these processes in more detail. Okay. Ultimately, again, I know I'm kind of being a little bit over redundant here. ATP, right? ATP production. That's the whole purpose of cell respiration, because ultimately we're going to use ATP for all the myriad chemical reactions that occur in the body, right? Be it catabolic or anabolic, they do require some form of energy, right? One way or another. Okay. And within this process, the majority of ATP molecules being produced actually occurs in the mitochondria, as we're going to take a look at. Okay. And again, the majority of living organisms, right, they essentially use glucose as a primary source of energy, right? With the exception of the archaic group, right, a type of prokaryote, where you would find them in these extreme environments and they just undergo some different type of chemical energy synthesis processes, chemosynthesis, right? But we're gonna leave that aside for now. Okay. Our go-to form of energy is glucose. Okay. So let's check out what happens, right? Let's see step one or stage one, right? Whatever you want to call it, glycolysis, right? So glyco meaning sugar, lysis meaning breakdown, right? So if you have difficulty, understanding or memorizing the whole process in itself, right? You can understand what occurs here just by the breakdown of the words, right? Glyco, sugar, lysis means to break down. Okay. It is important to know where these reactions are occurring, right? In the case of glycolysis, this is occurring in the cytosol of the cell. Okay. And again, here you have your initial reactant. If we go to our chemical equation, right? You have your sugar molecule here, right? Your glucose molecules. And what happens is that this glucose is essentially broken down to produce an intermediate molecule, right? If you notice here in the chemical equation, right, our products are ultimately carbon dioxide and water. So we're going to see how we get from these reactants, we end up with these molecules here. All right. From these reactants, we end up with these molecules here. And the carbon that you see here, this carbon dioxide, is ultimately the carbon in that carbon dioxide ultimately will come from the complete breakdown of sugar. Okay. And water will be the oxygen molecules will be used to produce water. Okay. We'll take a look at that. All right. So let's take a look. So like I mentioned before, the initial reactant for glycolysis is glucose, right? Glucose, as you know from the chemical equation, has 6 carbons, right? Which is, it's a 6 carbon molecule or compound, right? And what begins to happen is a partial breakdown in glycolysis, right? Where essentially you break glucose in half to become a 3 carbon compound. Remember, since you have a 6 carbon compound, it basically splits in half. And now you have 2 molecules of a 3 carbon compound, right? So if you notice, this little pathway that you see here is showing a partial breakdown of glucose, right? So you have glucose that it has a 6 carbon compound, breaks in half. 3 of the carbons create 1 compound, right? And the 3 other carbons create another set of this compound, right? Now, of course, these compounds have names, but that is beyond the scope of high school bio, right? Now, as this is occurring, other things are happening, right, within this pathway, right? First, in order to break down glucose, you need to have some energy, right? So you do need some form of ATP, right? Some consumption of ATP to actually break things down, right? So if you notice here, ATP is being consumed to break down glucose. But as this happens, right, these 2 3 carbon compounds are undergoing certain alterations, right? They're undergoing some um, um, isomeric changes, right? With the carbon or the carbons and the hydrogens being um, placed in different conformations, right? Ultimately, through the use and the liberation of hydrogen within these compounds, right? These hydrogens that are being released from these three carbon compounds are being used to provide a what are called electron carriers. If you remember from the ATP little subsection, how I talked about some electron carriers, right? NADH, right? FADH2. These are molecules that they're floating around in the cytoplasm and they want to collect electrons, right? And as they collect electrons, right, they are also collecting hydrogens to bond to them, right? So as this three carbon compound is being formed, altered through that whole process, hydrogens are being released. Electrons are also being transferred to other molecules, in this case, NADH, right? You do have some liberation of a hydrogen, right? If you see, here's one hydrogen from the two that are here, and here's the other hydrogen from the two that are here, right? So these NADHs are starting to form, and these are basically electron carriers, okay? Remember, since there's two three carbon compounds being formed, you're going to produce two NADHs, two, right? One here and one here. All right. As this process is happening, right? A result of this is pyruvate, right? As this process is occurring and undergoing this transfer of electrons and things like that, ATP is produced as a net product. And also, you have this final form, right? During this particular process, a three carbon compound that is called pyruvate. Very important, right? You need to know this compound, okay? And you have two of these compounds, right? So you have two compounds of pyruvate, all right? So aside from that, you have two ATPs produced per pyruvate. So you have a total of four, right? Now, what is the net gain of this process? All right, let's take a look. What are the net products of this particular process? Okay, so if you take a look here, let me just kind of get this red. For some reason, it's not doing it. Okay, if you take a look at my notes here, it says the final product is two molecules of pyruvate. All right, here's one, here's two molecules of ATP. But wait a second, you have two here and you have two here. That's four, right? But because you consumed two in the beginning, right? You have a net gain, a final gain of just two molecules of ATP. Okay, and those two molecules of ATP can be used immediately for any type of chemical processes and so forth and so forth. Okay. And then remember, this is all occurring in the cytosol. Okay. And you also have NADH. Okay, NADH being formed. All right. Now, these products, the pyruvate and the NADH, they're going to migrate. Okay, they're going to migrate into the mitochondria. All right, this is going to the second stage of the cell, of cell respiration. All right, let's take a look at the mitochondria now. Some little structures that you do need to remember. All right. So as you guys know already from the organelle chapter, right, mitochondria is a powerhouse of the cell, right? Because ATP is produced here. So you have this little structure that looks like a little bean. It's a double membrane structure, right? You have this inner membrane, all right, this little enfolded sac, and then you have the outer membrane, right? So you have two membranes, inner and outer membrane. And here's where you're producing the majority of ATP. Okay. And here is where you're also getting the aerobic part of respiration, right? When I mean aerobic, I am talking about oxygen consumption, right? So again, like I mentioned before, you have two membranes, right? And you have this little intermembrane space between the inner and outer membrane, right? And if you notice, there's a bunch of folds. There are many more folds than what you see here in this diagram, right? But of course, we know that the more folds something has, that increases the surface area, right, of the folds. Okay, the folds themselves are called cristae, right? And the whole purpose of having all these folds is to increase energy production, right? ATP production, right? Okay. And if you look closely, you see all these little molecules, right? You see ribosomes being present. You see these little crista being present. You see these little DNA strands being present, right? Um, and you have all these proteins embedded on the inner membrane. Okay. So if you take a look and you zoom into the membrane of the inner side, right, it looks something like this, right? So here you have this inner membrane. So imagine you're looking at the little pink membrane that you see here, right? And then the outer membrane, right? The one that you see here is the outer, the upper part. You have this intermembrane space, okay? And then you have the matrix, the fluid that's inside the inner membrane, right? It's referred to as the matrix. What do you see exactly? So embedded on the inner membrane are a bunch of transport proteins, are a bunch of channel proteins, right? That are involved, right? Signaling proteins, and um uh you have a cascade, right? A complex of proteins that are embedded on the inner membrane, right? Ultimately to produce ATP, right? So one of the more important structures that you need to know is an enzyme called ATP synthase. Okay, ATP synthase. And what happens here is that you have a chain, right, of passing of electrons, right, from one protein complex to another, to another, to another, to another, ultimately to pump hydrogens, right, to pass through this ATP synthase. And this ATP synthase, as hydrogens pass through this little kind of channel protein, it produces ATP. Okay. Now you do not need to know this level of detail. Okay, but just I want you to know the kind of schematics of what's happening. Okay, all these other proteins that you see here, right? They're all a group, right? It's a big complex, right? And the whole process in which ADH comes in and provides electrons to be transferred from one protein to another and another is referred to as the electron transport chain. Okay. And why is it important for electrons to pass by and pass by from one to another? It's because they help as electrons pass from one protein, from one complex to another, right? They enable hydrogens to pump through from one side of the inner membrane, from the matrix side into the inner membrane space side. And what that does is that it creates potential energy, right? You start to accumulate a lot of hydrogens here. You start to create a gradient where you get a lot of hydrogens pumping into this. So what's going to happen, right? You're creating a concentration gradient where you're having such a high concentration of hydrogens that they're going to start pumping through. And that potential energy passes through this ATP synthase as kinetic energy, as another form of energy, which serves to create ADP plus inorganic phosphate. They react together to produce ATP. Okay, so electrons serve to create hydrogen to produce ATP. Okay, very, very important, right? So really beyond that, you don't need to know the complexities of that, right? You don't even need to memorize these complexes, right? Just understand that this is the site that would create the actual ATP. And we're going to get back to this, okay? So how many mitochondria are inside a cell depends on the cell type, right? You're going to have more mitochondria in muscle cells, for example, that they require mechanical movement, which means they require ATP and so forth and so forth. But you're not going to have a lot of mitochondria where you basically have dead skin tissues, epithelial cells, for example, right? Anywhere where you have a lot of metabolic activity, most likely you're going to have higher amounts of mitochondria. Okay. So this is just, a little side note on the structure of mitochondria. Let's take a look now more in detail on aerobic respiration, right? Now, if we focus on the pathway after glycolysis, there's two routes that you can take. Okay, the first one is the aerobic respiration route, right? And that's whenever you have oxygen. Okay, this aerobic respiration route essentially, right, takes place in the mitochondria. It uses oxygen to produce water, and that use of oxygen will ultimately create a high amount of ATP. More specifically, 38 ATP by the end of this process. Okay, 38 ATP. Okay, and at the same time, the sugar, that pyruvate that we talked about, will be broken down to its most basic, simplest form, which is carbon dioxide. And that is where we get and exhale carbon dioxide from, right? From this cell respiration. Okay. So before we get into the next stage, which is the citric acid cycle, right, of aerobic respiration, there's a little prep phase that I notice not a lot of books talk about, right? Before you get into and the mitochondria gets into the pyruvate gets into the Krebs cycle, it actually needs to be groomed, cellular grooming, molecular grooming, and pyruvate needs to get a little bit smaller, right? Pyruvate actually breaks down into acetyl-CoA. Okay? So you have pyruvate, which is a 3-carbon compound, right? This pyruvate joins with an enzyme, right? This coenzyme A, right? If you remember the coenzymes that we talked about, right? With an SH group, they bind together and they liberate electrons to NAD+, more NAD pluses. So these little carriers come in, they get they accept an electron with some hydrogens, and they leave energized with electrons. A byproduct of this pyruvate is that it loses a carbon, right, in the form of carbon dioxide. The resulting form is a compound called acetyl-CoA. Okay. Now, acetyl-CoA can be used to get into the citric acid cycle, okay, or the Krebs cycle. So if you take a look here, as I put it designated as letter A, aerobic respiration, A1 phase. So this is the prep phase. And then A2, which is the actual citric acid cycle. Now, this could be used into the citric acid cycle. Okay. This occurs in the mitochondria, right? And by the way, this prep phase, right, occurs in the mitochondria. Okay. In the mitochondria. So you have the citric acid cycle. What happens, right? Here is where you fully break down sugar to pyruvate to acetyl-CoA to carbon dioxide. Okay. And remember, there's 2 of these, right? So if I were to look at this more specifically, there's 2 pyruvates, so you're going to get 2 acetyl-coenzyme A's, right? Okay. So as this acetyl-coenzyme A enters the mitochondria, all right, you have this citric acid that forms. And as one of the main functions of this citric acid cycle, right, is essentially to produce a lot of electron carriers. Take a look how many electron carriers are produced in the mitochondria. Okay. it's always good to know the products, right? The reactants that are coming in and the products that are leaving. Okay. You produce 6 NADH electron carriers. You produce another type of electron carrier called FADH2. Okay. And you produce 4 carbon dioxides. By this moment, sugar has completely broken down into carbon dioxide. Okay. Where are the other 2 carbons? Remember, sugar has 6 carbons. They were liberated over here. Okay, so technically you're producing 2 carbon dioxides. Okay. All right. So by that time, everything gets released. Okay. So let's look at this citric acid cycle a little bit more in detail, just for you to kind of figure out what's happening, right? You do not need to memorize this. Okay. You do not need to memorize. I'm just showing you what is happening in the citric acid cycle, right? So if you take a look, if we start here, acetyl coenzyme A, right, and you have 2 of these, right? This 2 carbon molecule comes in, it binds with several enzymes and produces several intermediates, right? But as you're going along, and there's these different chemical pathways that are changing this molecule, what's important to know is the carbons that are being released, changed, right? The molecules changing and so forth and so forth. Everything that's occurring is that there's a passage of electrons, okay, to NADHs, right? And as you're passing electrons to NAD plus to produce NADH, right? You're liberating a carbon, right? Then the molecule changes a little bit more, right? Here you have 6 carbons. Here you have 5 carbons, right? For the scope of high school biology, you don't need to know exactly everything that is occurring here. Just understand that as you're liberating carbon dioxide, you're also releasing electrons for these carriers to come in and take. All right. And you continue. You also produce a little bit of ATP or a GTP, right? You're producing some more electron carriers and more electron carriers. Ultimately, you want to restore a key molecule, right, called oxaloacetate. And this is like an intermediate molecule that always binds with acetyl-CoA to produce a 6 carbon sugar, right, which is in the form of a citrate, right, or citric acid, right? That's why it's called citric acid cycle. It produces a kind of form of citric acid or in a citrate form, right? Again, you don't need to know that, right? Just understand that acetyl-CoA comes in, binds to a molecule called oxaloacetate, and as it's running through and creating different variants of itself and losing carbons, it's also passing electrons to these carriers, right? Okay. And what you do ultimately need to know are the products, right? So through the process of the Krebs cycle, you produce 6 NADH, 2 FDH2s, 4 carbons as a product, as a residual product, right? And then this carbon dioxide is what we release when we exhale, right? When we breathe out, right? So that's where that carbon dioxide comes from. Ultimately, the products that you have here, okay, will go to the last stage, which is the electron transport chain that we see here again, right? So if you take a look, the NADHs that are bringing these electrons, right? They're carrying their electrons, they're providing it to this complex of proteins. And as these electrons are jumping from one to another, from one to another, from one to another, they're letting hydrogen pump into this intermembrane space, right? And what do you need the intermembrane, those hydrogens plus ions, right, to create a potential energy, right, to essentially drive ATP synthase to produce ATP. Okay. So Electrons pass through a series of enzymes. ATP is produced. Okay, this is referred to as oxidative phosphorylation, right? And one of the things that you do need to know is that if you take a look here, the electrons are passing, right? They're passing down from one protein to another, from one protein to another. But the last acceptor, right, of these electrons, right? The last acceptor of these electrons is water. Water, along with hydrogens, water, electrons, and hydrogens all work together. Don't worry about this this whole kind of crazy equation. You have a half of oxygen and two hydrogens. Ultimately, all of these electrons and hydrogens and oxygen atoms will bind together to produce water. Okay, so that's the reason why ultimately we need oxygen. Oxygen is actually the most electronegative atom that is attracting the electrons to itself, right? So it's helping kind of pass the electrons all the way to itself. But as the electrons pass down, they're pumping hydrogen, right? Once the electron joins with hydrogen and oxygen, it produces water, right? So this is basically how water is produced, okay? And then once these NADHs, right, have been consumed, right, and the electrons have been taken away from them, FADH plus, right, they go back to this citric acid cycle to produce and get more electrons and more electrons. So the cycle can continue again, right? FAD, sorry. Okay. So the cycle can continue. They can collect more electrons to go through the electron transport chain and back again and back again and back again, right? Okay. So in a nutshell, this is what aerobic respiration is about. Okay. Glycolysis. From glycolysis, you produce pyruvate. Pyruvate, you undergo a intermediate change called acetyl-CoA that enters the citric acid cycle where you're producing a lot of electron carriers, which will ultimately go to the electron transport chain, other known as oxidative phosphorylation. And here's where you get the biggest amount of ATP production from this molecule called ATP synthase. All right, so make sure you memorize ATP synthase is where the majority of ATP is being produced, okay? Electron transport chain, okay? Here, this is a very nice visual for you to kind of study the process, right? If you can explain the study, the process, right? Glycolysis occurs in the cytosol, okay? Here, you get a net gain of 2 ATPs. All right. Citric acid cycle, you have also a net gain of 2 ATPs, but they're more GTPs, right? You're getting NADH formed, electrons passing by. Ultimately, everything will condense into the electron transport chain, and that is where you produce, where you get the majority of ATPs, right? Generally 34. Counting together, the max amount of ATPs that you get is 38, right? Here's where you get approximately 38, depending on the organism, right, and the chemical pathways. You get around 38 ATPs being produced. Okay, everything I've talked about is nicely discussed in this table. The tables help guys a lot to describe what is happening. Okay, please study the tables. They're very, very informative. They're very detailed for you guys to know the process, right? Okay, so you have glycolysis, citric acid, and the electron transport chain. Okay, this is aerobic respiration, right? Aerobic respiration occurs in in the mitochondria with the presence of oxygen. Okay, good, good. All right, let's take a look at anaerobic respiration. What happens when you don't have oxygen. Okay. There's two processes that you could undergo. You could undergo depending on the organism, if you're a bacteria or a fungi, right? If you're or animals, right? Um, and anaerobic respiration occurs if there isn't any oxygen, like I mentioned, and it occurs in the cytosol, right? And these organisms, they're referred to as anaerobes, or they're in anaerobic conditions. Okay. And there's two types. There's alcoholic anaerobic respiration, lactic acid anaerobic respiration. And the term anaerobic respiration could be also known as fermentation. When you guys think about fermentation, or fermenting wine or things like that, this is exactly what's happening, right? So you have two forms: alcohol fermentation and lactic acid fermentation. It always starts with glycolysis. So we know glycolysis now, right? It's basically the breakdown of the sugar into the 3-carbon compound, which is pyruvate, right? Which is pyruvate. All right. So let's take a look at this alcohol fermentation, right? Alcohol fermentation, you have this situation where you have plants and many microorganisms can undergo alcohol fermentation, yeast and bacteria, right? And the reason why it's called alcohol fermentation is that it produces a type of alcohol, right? Ethanol, right? And there's several variants, but ethanol is basically what it's being produced. Okay. And aside from ethanol, you're producing carbon dioxide and 2 ATPs, right? And 2 ATPs. Not that efficient. Of course, if you refer to it compared to the 38 ATPs that were being produced, right? Not that great, right? But it works, right? A use of this for human consumption, of course, are alcoholic beverages, right? Wine, beer, but you could also use it for bread, right? Yeast can produce the alcohol in bread, and the little bubbles that you see in the spaces of the bread to make it rise is carbon dioxide, right? And you also get the ethanol, but of course, the ethanol, we don't feel it when we're eating bread. We don't get drunk or anything. It's because it evaporates, right? It evaporates so easily, so you never would feel that. Um, and of course, ethanol does need to get processed within these organisms, or in itself, it could become toxic to the organism and basically kill it, right? Um, so this is alcoholic fermentation or alcohol fermentation. All right. Similarly to alcohol fermentation, we have lactic acid fermentation, and this is what humans undergo whenever we don't have enough oxygen circulating in our muscles and our body, especially when we're doing exercise, right? So what happens, right? When our body requires more ATP than what aerobic respiration can produce, right? Some cells can get that oxygen, right? Not all cells, we can supply all the cells with oxygen when we're doing strenuous exercise, right? So they have to rely on something else, which is lactic acid fermentation, right? So a product of this pathway is lactic acid, okay? And lactic acid, right, is the reason why we feel sore whenever we do too much strenuous exercise, right? We get sore, we have muscle fatigue. It's because we've accumulated too much lactic acid, and it takes a while for the lactic acid to go away, right? That's why you feel sore for a certain amount of time, right? For a couple of days and so forth, right? Again, glucose isn't broken down completely. Okay. It's converted to lactic acid. It produces a little bit of ATP, right? So it isn't efficient, right, for us to be using it on the long run. It's just for emergency cases, if I can say, right? A byproduct is lactic acid that accumulates within the muscle tissue, right? And it's the reason for the muscle soreness, okay? And here is a summary of what I just mentioned, right? So glucose undergoes glycolysis, breaks down into pyruvate, right? And then this pyruvate, and actually, let me take a look here. This glucose is actually pyruvate, So let me just, this is pyruvate. Okay. Pyruvate, and this would also be pyruvate. This is more specific. Pyruvate, right? This pyruvate would undergo alcoholic fermentation or lactic acid fermentation, depending on the organism, right? And depending if, again, the presence of oxygen. Okay. And that's in a nutshell, pretty much cell respiration, right? Cellular respiration, which can be broken down into anaerobic and aerobic respiration. Okay. Tables are very, very important to study, guys. Make sure you memorize the location of each stage. Does it require oxygen, right? What are the products? What are the reactants being used, right? And so forth. And even the ATP that is being produced, right? Aerobic respiration producing the highest amount of molecules of ATP. Okay. One thing about anaerobic respiration is that it can produce ATP incredibly fast, right? Not as efficient in terms of quantity, but it does produce it quickly, much quicker than aerobic respiration. Okay. But it isn't good on the long run. Okay. And lastly, we've talked about factors that affect the rate of photosynthesis. We can take a look at the factors that affect respiration, right? Very, very similar, right? We've talked about how enzymes and temperature and certain tolerance ranges, right, or for enzymes to work. Definitely, as temperature increases, right, respiration rate does tend to increase until you reach a critical temperature where the enzymes begin to denature, right? So temperature is definitely a factor that is involved in respiration. Ultimately, you're going to break and denature the proteins, right? So nothing will continue, right? Especially in the electron transport chain, right? Aside from that, right? You will also, what are your inputs, right? What are your initial inputs? Glucose, right? Concentrations of glucose. If you have more molecules of glucose, you do have a certain amount of respiration rate increasing, but you're gonna reach a maximum where all the enzymes are being saturated and you consume. So you will reach a saturation point, right? That goes along with glucose. The same thing goes with oxygen, right? It takes time for oxygen to come in and collect the electrons, for oxygen to go to the electron transport chain. So you will have a maximum also of respiration rate, right? Depending on these factors. Okay. So, and lastly, relationships, right? You do need to know relationships between photosynthesis and cell respiration, right? I've talked about it before in the prep phase also. Um, the products of one become the reactants of the other, right? So, as you know, autotrophs, they can perform photosynthesis and cell respiration. And of course, depending on the tissues, right? Root cells, they don't have chloroplasts because they're underground. They can't photosynthesize, right? But aside from that, right? Um, you have this concept where you have photosynthesis occurring in the chloroplast. Of course, remember that the chloroplast is the site of photosynthesis, right? You're getting light, you're um, using carbon dioxide and water. It's coming in, undergoing these two reactions, right? Producing glucose, producing oxygen. These two products can be used for the mitochondria that undergoes glycolysis and um, aerobic respiration, right? Which will ultimately produce carbon dioxide and water again to be used by chloroplasts, right? So the products of one become the reactants of the other, right? And there's a concept that you're gonna hear, right? That the rate in which you have the amount of carbon dioxide that you put in the process of photosynthesis, right? That concentration level, when it equates the amount of um, uh, oxygen that is also being produced and consumed, right, is referred to as the compensation point. right? So the two levels between oxygen and carbon dioxide, when they equate each other, when they're equal to each other, is referred to as a compensation point, and you have a good balance between photosynthesis and cell respiration. All right. Again, here it's very important to know the tables, right? Know the features, know the location, when things are occurring, right? Sites, photosynthesis in the chloroplast, aerobic respiration in the mitochondria, when, all the time. Photosynthesis depends if there's the presence of light, input, outputs, energy sources, energy results, right? Energy stored, okay, is basically the glucose, okay? All right. With that being said, that finishes cell respiration, okay? Make sure you study both of these. When we come back, we will review some of the concepts. If you have questions, please have questions when you come. I will not go over this in incredible detail. Just any questions that you might have. And we'll be doing several labs, a couple of labs based on photosynthesis and cell respiration. All right, guys. So, and of course, review ATP, right? ATP. So that being said, guys, that's it for this video. Okay. And enjoy your summer break.